The woman blocked his path by the mailbox, her voice cracking with frustration. "Why do you keep avoiding me?" Daniel stood frozen, clutching the unopened letters in his hand, his eyes refusing to meet her face. For 6 months, he had mastered the art of disappearing whenever she appeared. Not because he hated her, but because every time he looked at her, something inside him shattered all over again. She didn't know that to him. She was never just a neighbor. So, what was it about this woman's eyes that made a single father run from his own life? Daniel Harris had built his life around avoiding the unexpected. Every morning at 6:15, he woke before his alarm. By 6:45, he had breakfast ready for his son. At 7:20, he walked Ethan to the bus stop at the end of their street in this quiet Oregon suburb. Then he returned home, sat at his desk, and worked until 3:00 the afternoon. He picked up Ethan, made dinner, helped with homework, and put the boy to bed by 8:30. The routine never changed. It was the only thing keeping him together. 2 years ago, his wife Emily died in a car accident. She had been driving to the pharmacy late at night because Ethan had a fever and they were out of children's medicine. Daniel had asked her to go. He remembered standing in the doorway, watching her grab her keys, telling her to drive safe. She had smiled at him, said she loved him, and he had responded with nothing more than a nod and a reminder to be careful. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her. An hour later, a police officer knocked on his door. After the funeral, Daniel couldn't stay in their old house. Every corner held a memory. Every room echoed with her voice. He sold everything, packed what little remained of their life, and moved to this small town where nobody knew his name or his story. He cut off contact with Emily's family completely. Her mother, Margaret, had screamed at him at the burial, calling him a murderer, blaming him for sending Emily out that night. He couldn't argue with her. He blamed himself, too. Ethan was only 5 when his mother died. Now at 7, the boy's memories of her had faded into something distant and unclear. He remembered her smell. Sometimes he remembered a song she used to sing, but her face was becoming harder to recall without looking at photographs. Lately, Ethan had started asking more questions about her. What was she like? Did she love me? Why did she have to go? Each question drove a knife deeper into Daniel's chest. But he answered them as best he could, because his son deserved at least that much. 6 months ago, a woman moved into the house next door. Daniel noticed her the day the moving truck arrived. He had glanced out his window and felt his heart stop. She had the same dark hair, the same way of tilting her head when she looked at something, the same gentle curve to her shoulders. But it was her eyes that destroyed him. When she turned toward his house and their gazes accidentally met, Daniel saw Emily staring back at him. He knew immediately who she was. Sarah Mitchell, Emily's older sister, the one who had been living in New York for years, the one who missed the funeral because she was overseas for work. From that day on, Daniel made it his mission to never cross paths with her. He memorized her schedule through careful observation. She left for work at 7:50, so he made sure Ethan caught the bus at 7:20. She came home around 4:30, so he stayed inside until after 5. On weekends, he watched from behind his curtains to see when she went out, then timed his own errands around her absence. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. Every glimpse of her face sent him spiraling back to the night Emily died. Sarah tried to be friendly at first. She waved at him from her driveway, but he pretended not to see. She left a plate of cookies on his porch with a note introducing herself, and he threw them away without reading it. Once, she called out to him when he was getting his mail, and he turned around and walked back inside without a word. He knew he was being cruel, but cruelty was easier than confrontation. Cruelty didn't require him to explain why. Looking at her made him feel like he was drowning. One afternoon, Sarah saw Ethan playing alone in the backyard. Danielle was inside on a work call, unaware that his son had wandered outside. From her kitchen window, Sarah watched the boy kicking a ball against the fence, and something in her chest tightened. She recognized that profile, the shape of his nose, the way his hair fell across his forehead. This was her nephew, the child Emily had written about in every letter. The boy Sarah had never properly met because she had been too proud, too busy, too far away to come home. She had last seen Ethan when he was barely 2 years old, a toddler who wouldn't remember her face. Now he was 7, and he had no idea that the woman next door was his aunt. That Saturday morning, Sarah decided she had waited long enough. She positioned herself by the mailboxes at the end of the driveway, knowing Daniel would come out eventually. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times in her head. But when she finally saw him walking toward her, all her prepared words vanished. He spotted her too late to retreat. His steps slowed, his jaw tightened, and she could see him calculating whether he could grab his mail and escape before she spoke. She didn't give him the chance. She stepped directly into his path, blocking his way to the mailbox, and forced him to acknowledge her existence. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, cracking with 6 months of accumulated frustration and hurt. She asked him why he kept avoiding her, what she had done to deserve being treated like a stranger. Daniel stood there, clutching his unopened letters, refusing to meet her eyes. His knuckles were white against the paper. Sarah pressed harder. She told him it had been 6 months. 6 months of watching him disappear every time she stepped outside. 6 months of being ignored, of having her attempts at basic neighborly kindness rejected. She wasn't asking to be his friend. She just wanted to know what she had done wrong. She told him she deserved at least that much. An explanation. A reason. Anything other than this inexplicable coldness. Daniel finally looked at her. It was a mistake. Her eyes were exactly like Emily's, that particular shade of brown that caught the light in a way he had never seen in anyone else. For a moment, he wasn't standing in his driveway in Oregon. He was back in their old kitchen, watching Emily laugh at something he said, watching those same eyes crinkle at the corners. The grief hit him like a physical blow, sudden and overwhelming. And before he could stop himself, the truth spilled out. He told her that looking at her hurt. Then he pushed past her and walked back to his house without another word, leaving her standing alone by the mailbox with a question she couldn't begin to understand. Sarah didn't move for a long time. She stood there replaying his words, trying to make sense of them. Looking at her caused him pain. What could that possibly mean? She wasn't a threat. She hadn't done anything to him. They had never even had a real conversation. But something about the way he said it, the raw anguish in his voice, made her think this wasn't about her at all. This was about something deeper, something he was running from. And for the first time, she began to wonder if Daniel knew exactly who she was. That evening, after Clear's throat, Ethan had gone to bed. Daniel sat alone in his living room, staring at a photograph of Emily. He had said too much. He knew that the words had escaped before he could catch them. And now, Sarah would start asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He considered packing up again, finding another town, starting over somewhere she couldn't follow. But he was tired of running. And Ethan had finally started making friends at school. Finally seemed happy in a way he hadn't been since Emily died. Daniel couldn't take that away from him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He knew who it was before he even stood up. When he opened the door, Sarah was standing on his porch with her arms crossed over her chest. She looked like she had been crying, though her eyes were dry now. She told him they needed to talk. He told her there was nothing to talk about. But before he could close the door, a small voice came from behind him. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He asked who was at the door. Daniel told him to go back to bed. But the boy was already coming down the steps. Sarah saw him clearly for the first time at close range. His smile when he looked at his father, curious and innocent. It was Emily's smile. Exactly, Emily's smile. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Daniel quickly guided Ethan back toward the stairs, telling him everything was fine, that he should go back to sleep. The boy obeyed reluctantly, glancing over his shoulder at the woman in the doorway before disappearing into his room. When Daniel turned back to Sarah, her expression had changed. The frustration was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. She asked him directly. She wanted to know if he knew who she was. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at her standing in his doorway, this woman who shared Emily's blood and Emily's face, and he realized he couldn't keep lying. Not to her, not about this. He told her yes. He knew she was Sarah, Emily's sister, the sister who had been living across the country, who had missed the funeral, who had been absent from Emily's life for years before she died. Sarah absorbed his words in silence. Then she asked him why he never said anything, why he spent 6 months pretending she was a stranger instead of acknowledging who she was. Daniel's answer was simple. He told her that every time he saw her face, he saw Emily. Every time he heard her voice, he heard his wife. Being near her forced him to remember everything he had spent 2 years trying to bury. He told her about the guilt, how Emily died because of him because he asked her to go out that night because he couldn't be bothered to drive to the pharmacy himself. He told her he couldn't bear to look at Sarah because she was a living reminder of the worst mistake he ever made. When he finished, Sarah stood very still. Her expression had hardened into something unreadable. Then she spoke, and her words cut through him like a blade. She asked if he thought he was the only one in pain. Before he could respond, she turned and walked back to her house, leaving him alone with the question echoing in the empty space between them. The days following their confrontation were heavy with silence. Daniel returned to his routine, but it felt hollow now. He still watched Sarah's house from behind his curtains, still timed his movements to avoid hers. But the purpose had shifted. Before he was hiding from the pain of seeing her face. Now he was hiding from the shame of what he had confessed. He had told her things he had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even to himself in the darkest hours of the night, and she had walked away without a word of comfort or condemnation, leaving him suspended in uncertainty. Sarah spent those same days replaying their conversation in her mind. She had asked him if he thought he was the only one suffering, but she hadn't stayed to hear his answer. The truth was, she wasn't ready to share her own pain. Not yet. For 5 years before Emily's death, Sarah had lived in New York, building a career she thought mattered more than family. She and Emily had drifted apart after a bitter argument about their mother, Margaret, and the distance between them had grown wider with each passing year. Emily kept writing letters, kept trying to bridge the gap, but Sarah never wrote back. She told herself she was too busy, that there would be time later to reconcile. Then Emily died, and later never came. Sarah was in London for a work conference when she got the call. By the time she arranged a flight back to the States, the funeral was already over. Margaret never forgave her for that. Her mother screamed at her on the phone, calling her selfish, accusing her of abandoning her sister when she needed her most. Sarah couldn't argue. Everything Margaret said was true. She had chosen her career over her family, and now she would carry that choice for the rest of her life. Daniel didn't know any of this. He only knew that Sarah had been absent, that she hadn't been there when Emily was buried, that she had stayed away while he grieved alone with a 5-year-old who kept asking where Mommy went. He had resented her for that in a distant way. But now, standing in the wreckage of his confession, he began to wonder what her absence had cost her. Her question echoed in his mind. Did he really think he was the only one in pain? The answer, he was beginning to realize, was more complicated than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Ethan had started asking about the neighbor lady. He wanted to know why she never came over, why Daddy always seemed upset when she was around. Daniel deflected the questions as best he could, telling Ethan that adults sometimes had complicated relationships, that it wasn't anything he needed to worry about. But the boy was perceptive in the way children often are. He sensed that something was wrong, even if he couldn't name it. At night, he started having dreams about his mother again, waking up crying for a woman whose face he could barely remember. A week after their confrontation, Sarah appeared at Daniel's door in the middle of the day. Ethan was at school and Daniel was working from home as usual. He almost didn't answer when he saw her through the window, but something in her posture made him reconsider. She looked different. The frustration was gone from her face, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. She was holding a small cardboard box against her chest. Daniel opened the door but didn't invite her in. He asked what she wanted, his voice flat and guarded. Sarah told him she had something to show him, something he needed to see. She said she wasn't there to fight or to demand anything from him. She just wanted him to understand why she was here, why she had moved to this specific house, in this specific town. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her enter. They sat across from each other in his living room, the box between them on the coffee table. Sarah opened it slowly and pulled out a stack of envelopes. each one addressed to her in handwriting. Daniel recognized immediately. It was Emily's handwriting. He had seen it on grocery lists, on birthday cards, on the note she left on the kitchen counter the night she died, telling him she would be back soon. His throat tightened at the sight of those familiar loops and curves. Sarah explained that Emily had written to her every few months for 5 years. She had documented her life in those letters, sharing stories about her marriage, her pregnancy, her joy when Ethan was born. She wrote about Daniel constantly, describing him as the best man she had ever known, someone who made her feel safe and loved in a way she had never experienced before. She wrote about wanting Sarah to come home to meet Ethan, to be part of their family again, and Sarah had never responded. Not once. She handed Daniel the last letter Emily ever wrote, dated 2 weeks before the accident. He took it with trembling hands and read it in silence. Emily's words were warm and hopeful, talking about how Ethan was growing so fast, how he had started asking about Aunt Sarah, how Emily wished her sister could see the life she had built. At the end, Emily wrote that she missed Sarah every day, that she hoped someday they could start over, that she loved her no matter what. Daniel finished reading and looked up at Sarah, who had tears running down her cheeks. Sarah told him the rest. After Emily's death, she had fallen apart completely. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. By the time she returned to the country, Daniel had already moved away and cut off all contact with the Mitchell family. Margaret blamed both of them equally, Daniel for causing the accident and Sarah for being absent when it mattered. For 2 years, Sarah tried to find where Daniel had gone, but he had covered his tracks well. Finally, she hired a private investigator who located him in Oregon. She spent months arranging the move, selling her apartment in New York, transferring to a local school. She told Daniel she hadn't come here by accident. She had spent 2 years searching for him. Danielle asked her why. What could she possibly want from him, Clear's throat, after all this time? Sarah's answer was simple. She wanted to know her nephew. She wanted to be part of Ethan's life, to fulfill the promise she should have made to Emily when her sister was still alive. And she wanted to stop running from her guilt, even if that meant facing the man who reminded her of everything she had lost. She told Daniel that she understood now why looking at her caused him pain, because looking at him caused her the same pain. They were 2 people haunted by the same ghost, blaming themselves for a tragedy neither of them could have prevented. For the first time since Emily died, Daniel felt something other than guilt when he thought about that night. He felt understood. Sarah wasn't there to judge him or absolve him. She was there because she was drowning in the same ocean of regret, and she had finally found someone who knew what it felt like. They sat in silence for a long time, the letters scattered between them, neither knowing what to say next. But something had shifted. The wall Daniel had built around himself had developed its first crack. Daniel agreed to let Sarah see Ethan, but only as the neighbor. He wasn't ready to explain the truth to his son, wasn't sure how a 7-year-old would process the sudden appearance of an aunt he didn't know existed. Sarah accepted the condition without argument. She understood that trust had to be built slowly, that pushing too hard would only drive Daniel back behind his walls. Their interaction started small. Sarah would wave at Ethan when he was playing in the yard, and Daniel would allow it. Then she started bringing over homemade cookies, sitting on the porch while Ethan told her about school and his friends and the video game he was trying to beat. Daniel watched from inside, protective and weary, but also something else, something he didn't want to name. Ethan took to Sarah quickly. He liked her stories and her laugh. He liked that she listened to him without interrupting, that she remembered the details he shared and asked follow-up questions the next time they spoke. One afternoon, she baked a cake with him, and when Daniel came outside to check on them, Ethan was covered in flour and grinning wider than Daniel had seen in months. The boy told his father that Sarah's cake smelled like something from a dream, something he couldn't quite remember, but knew was good. Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had expected to resent Sarah's presence, to count the days until she gave up and left them alone. Instead, he found himself watching for her through the window, not to avoid her, but to see her. He noticed the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way her hands moved when she talked, the small dimple that appeared on her left cheek when she smiled. These were not Emily's gestures. They belonged to Sarah alone, and that realization troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The question began to haunt him at night when the house was quiet and Ethan was asleep. If he developed feelings for Sarah, what would that mean? She was Emily's sister, the woman who shared his wife's blood, who carried echoes of his wife's face. Was it possible to love her without it being a betrayal? Or would any affection he felt be nothing more than a desperate attempt to hold on to a ghost? He didn't know the answer, and the uncertainty kept him awake until dawn. Sarah was fighting the same battle. She had come here for Ethan, to be the aunt she should have been all along. She hadn't expected to feel anything for Daniel beyond guilt and awkwardness, but watching him with his son, seeing the tenderness in his eyes when he helped Ethan with homework or bandaged a scraped knee, she began to see the man Emily had written about in all those letters. The best man she ever knew. Sarah caught herself thinking about him at odd hours, wondering what he was doing, whether he was sleeping, whether he was lonely. The thoughts made her feel sick with shame. Emily had only been gone 2 years. What kind of sister would fall for her dead sister's husband? One night, everything nearly collapsed. Ethan had a nightmare and woke up screaming for his mother. Daniel ran to his room and held him, but the boy wouldn't stop crying. He kept asking for Mommy, kept saying he saw her in his dream, and then she disappeared. Daniel felt helpless, in a way he hadn't experienced since the early days of grief. When every night was a battle just to survive, Sarah heard the commotion from her house and came over without thinking. She knocked once, then let herself in when no one answered. She found Daniel sitting on Ethan's bed, the boy sobbing in his arms, and without a word, she sat down beside them. She started singing softly, an old lullaby she remembered from childhood, something their grandmother used to sing to both her and Emily when they were small. Ethan's crying gradually slowed. His breathing steadied. Within minutes, he was asleep again. Daniel looked at Sarah in the dim light of his son's bedroom, and something passed between them that neither could deny. Ethan stirred slightly and mumbled that Sarah sang just like his mommy. Then he drifted back into peaceful sleep. Sarah met Daniel's eyes, and the weight of the moment pressed down on both of them. They were standing on the edge of something neither was prepared to name. Margaret Mitchell arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without warning. Sarah was at work and Daniel was in his home office when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Emily's mother standing on his porch, her face twisted with fury. She pushed past him without waiting to be invited inside, her eyes scanning the living room as if searching for evidence of a crime. Margaret told him she knew everything. She had found out that Sarah was living next door, that she had been spending time with Ethan, that the two of them had been keeping secrets from the family. She called Daniel a murderer, the same word she had hurled at him during Emily's funeral. She accused him of killing her daughter and then seducing her other daughter out of some sick need to replace what he had lost. Daniel tried to defend himself, tried to explain that it wasn't like that, but Margaret refused to listen. She threatened him with legal action. She said she would sue for visitation rights, that she would take him to court and make sure everyone knew what kind of man he really was. She told him she had already started talking to the neighbors, warning them about the monster living in their midst. Daniel felt his world crumbling around him. Everything he had built here, the quiet life, the fresh start, the fragile peace he had found, all of it was being torn apart by a grieving woman who needed someone to blame. That evening, Sarah came home to find her mother waiting in her driveway. Margaret's confrontation with her was even worse. She called Sarah a traitor, a disgrace to Emily's memory, a woman without shame or decency. She demanded that Sarah choose between her family and the man who killed her sister. There was no middle ground, no room for nuance or explanation. Margaret wanted Sarah to pack her bags and return to New York immediately to cut Daniel out of her life forever. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, rumors had spread throughout the neighborhood. Parents at Ethan's school started keeping their children away from him. A boy in his class told him that his father was a murderer, that he had heard it from his mother. Ethan came home that afternoon with tears streaming down his face, and a question that shattered Daniel completely. He asked his father if it was true. He asked if Daddy had killed Mommy. Daniel knelt in front of his son and tried to explain, tried to find words that a 7-year-old could understand. He told Ethan that Mommy died in an accident, that nobody killed her, that sometimes terrible things happened and nobody was to blame. But even as he spoke, he didn't believe his own words. In his heart, he still carried the conviction that Emily's death was his fault. And now his son was being punished for a crime Daniel had committed against himself. That night, Daniel told Sarah to leave. He stood on her porch in the darkness and told her that her family had brought nothing but pain into his life. First Emily's death, now this. He told her to go back to her mother, to go back to New York, to leave him and Ethan alone before things got any worse. Sarah tried to protest, tried to remind him that they were on the same side, but Daniel's walls had gone back up higher than ever. He walked away, without looking back, leaving her alone in the cold. Inside his house, Daniel sat in the dark and stared at nothing. He had been foolish to think he could outrun his past. He had been foolish to let Sarah into their lives, to let himself feel something other than grief. Now Ethan was hurting. The neighbors thought he was a killer, and Margaret was threatening to drag him through the courts. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't deserve to be a father. Maybe the kindest thing he could do was disappear and let Ethan grow up without the shadow of his guilt hanging over him. Daniel spent the next 3 days packing boxes. He moved through the house like a ghost, wrapping dishes in newspaper, folding clothes into suitcases, taking down the photographs from the walls. Ethan watched him with confused eyes, asking where they were going and why they had to leave. Daniel didn't have good answers. He told his son that sometimes people needed to start over, that there was nothing wrong with finding a new place to call home. But even as he spoke, he could hear the hollowness in his own voice. On the third night, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone in the empty living room. The furniture was still there, but the walls were bare. The shelves cleared of books and trinkets. Only one photograph remained. He held it in his hands, staring at Emily's face in the dim light from the street. She was laughing in the picture, caught mid-motion at some birthday party years ago. He couldn't remember whose birthday it was or why she was laughing. He just remembered that she looked happy and that he had been the one holding the camera. He spoke to her in the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her he was sorry. He told her he had tried to build something good for their son, tried to give Ethan a stable life in a place where nobody knew their story, but he had failed. The past had caught up with him, and now everything was falling apart. He told her he didn't know what to do anymore, didn't know how to keep going when every step forward seemed to lead back to the same pain. A small sound made him turn. Ethan was standing in the doorway, his pajamas wrinkled from sleep, his eyes wet with tears he was trying not to shed. The boy crossed the room and climbed into his father's lap, wrapping his thin arms around Daniel's neck. He said he had heard Daddy talking. He said he didn't want to move again. And then, in a voice that cracked with fear, he said he didn't want to lose his daddy too. Daniel held his son and felt something break inside him. Not the brittle shell of grief he had been carrying for 2 years, but something deeper. The wall he had built to protect himself from feeling anything at all. Ethan needed him. Not a perfect father, not a man without guilt or pain, but him, the flawed, broken person who was trying his best and failing more often than not. Running away wouldn't protect Ethan. It would only teach him that love was something temporary, something that could be packed into boxes and abandoned when things got hard. Across the fence, Sarah was having her own reckoning. Margaret had stayed in town, renting a room at a motel, and calling Sarah every few hours to demand an answer. The question was always the same. Was Sarah going to choose her family, or the man who destroyed it? There was no middle ground in Margaret's world, no space for complexity or forgiveness. Emily was dead. Someone had to pay. And Daniel was the easiest target for a mother's unprocessed grief. Sarah sat in her kitchen with her phone in her hand, staring at her mother's latest text message. "Come home. Leave him. Honor your sister's memory." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She thought about Emily, about all those letters she never answered, about the years she wasted being angry over something she couldn't even remember anymore. She thought about the last line Emily ever wrote to her. "I love you no matter what." Her sister had died, still hoping they would reconcile. And now Margaret was asking Sarah to honor that memory by perpetuating the same hatred that had kept them apart. The next morning, Sarah drove to her mother's motel. Margaret opened the door with a look of triumph, assuming her daughter had come to surrender. But Sarah didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway and told her mother that she wasn't leaving. She told her that Emily had loved Daniel more than anything in the world, that their marriage had been happy and full of joy, that Emily would never have wanted this vendetta. Margaret started to argue, her voice rising with familiar anger, but Sarah cut her off. She pulled out the last letter Emily had written, the one she had shown Daniel weeks ago. She read it aloud, forcing her mother to hear every word. Emily's description of her happiness, her gratitude for the life she had built, her declaration that Daniel was the best man she had ever known. When Sarah finished reading, she looked at her mother and saw something she hadn't seen in 2 years. Margaret's face had crumpled. The anger was gone, replaced by raw, unguarded grief. Margaret began to cry, not the sharp, accusatory tears she had shed at the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She sank onto the edge of the motel bed and wept for her daughter, not for the injustice of her death, not for the need to punish someone, but simply for the loss itself, for the empty chair at holidays, for the phone calls that would never come, for the grandchild she had pushed away in her desperate search for someone to blame. Sarah sat beside her and held her hand, and for the first time since Emily died, they grieved together instead of apart. Sarah found Daniel the next evening sitting on his porch steps with an unopened beer beside him. The boxes were still stacked inside his house, but something in his posture had changed. He looked tired rather than defeated. When he saw her coming, he didn't get up to leave. He just watched her approach and waited. She was carrying a small box, different from the one she had brought before. Inside were photographs from her childhood, pictures of her and Emily as little girls swimming in a backyard pool dressed up for Halloween, sitting on their grandmother's lap. She sat down beside Daniel and spread the photographs between them, pointing out the similarities she had never noticed before. The shape of Emily's eyes, the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Sarah told Daniel that she understood now why looking at her caused him pain. She carried pieces of Emily in her face, in her gestures, in ways neither of them could control. But she also told him something else. If he spent his life running from those reminders, he would be running from Emily herself. The woman he loved wasn't just in the photographs on his walls. She was in Sarah's eyes, in Ethan's smile, in all the people who had loved her and been changed by that love. Running away meant leaving all of that behind. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told her about the night Emily died, about the phone call he replayed in his mind every day. She had said she loved him, and he hadn't said it back. He had told her to drive carefully, as if that was a substitute for the words she deserved to hear. He had lived with that regret for 2 years, convinced that his last moment with his wife had been a failure of love. Sarah shook her head. She told him that Emily knew. She knew he loved her every single day they were together. One phone call couldn't erase years of devotion. One moment of distraction couldn't undo a lifetime of being present. Emily had written about it in her letters. The way Daniel made her feel safe. The way he showed up for her in 1,000 small ways that mattered more than grand gestures. He hadn't failed her. He had loved her completely, and she had known it until the very end. Daniel felt the tears coming, and for once, he didn't try to stop them. He cried in a way he hadn't allowed himself since the night of the accident, not the controlled private tears he sometimes shed when Ethan was asleep, but real, unguarded grief that shook his shoulders and blurred his vision. Sarah didn't try to comfort him with words. She just sat beside him and let him feel everything he had been running from. When he could speak again, Daniel told her his deepest fear. He was afraid that if he stopped hurting, it would mean he had forgotten Emily. The pain was the last thing tying him to her. If he let it go, she might disappear completely. Sarah took his hand and told him the truth. He would never forget. Emily would always be part of him, part of Ethan, part of the family they had built together. But he could remember her with love instead of pain. He could honor her memory by living instead of just surviving. The next day, Daniel and Sarah sat down with Ethan and told him the truth. They explained that Emily had a sister named Sarah, that Sarah was his aunt, that she had come to Oregon specifically to be part of his life. Ethan listened with wide eyes, processing this new information with the seriousness of a child trying very hard to understand adult things. When they finished, he looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then he asked if she was really his aunt. Daniel confirmed it. Ethan thought about this, his small face scrunched in concentration. Finally, he smiled and said he liked that. He said it explained why Sarah sang like his mommy, because they were sisters, and sisters probably learned the same songs. Daniel felt his heart swell at his son's simple acceptance. Children were resilient in ways adults often forgot. They could absorb new truths and keep moving forward, unburdened by the need to reconcile the past with the present. 6 months passed. The boxes Daniel had packed were unpacked. The photographs went back on the walls, joined now by new ones. Daniel and Ethan at the county fair. Sarah teaching Ethan to ride a bike. The three of them had a picnic in the park, laughing at something outside the frame. Emily's picture remained in its place of honor on the mantel, but it no longer felt like a shrine to grief. It felt like a window to someone who had been loved and was still remembered. Margaret came to visit once a month. Her relationship with Daniel remained complicated, marked by awkward silences and careful conversations. But she tried. She brought presents for Ethan and asked about his school. She looked at the photographs of Emily without flinching. The anger that had consumed her for 2 years had not disappeared entirely, but it had softened into something more bearable. She was learning slowly to miss her daughter without needing someone to blame. Daniel no longer checked the window before stepping outside. He no longer timed his movements around Sarah's schedule. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, 2 households that functioned almost as one. Sarah had dinner with them most nights. She helped Ethan with his homework while Daniel cooked. On weekends, they took walks through the neighborhood or drove to the coast to watch the waves. Neither of them had put a name to what they were becoming. The labels didn't matter yet. What mattered was that they were moving forward together. One morning, Daniel walked out to get his mail and found Sarah already there, standing by the mailbox where everything had started. She was holding an envelope, some piece of junk mail that didn't matter. When she saw him approaching, she smiled. It was a real smile, unguarded and warm. And it didn't make him think of Emily anymore. It just made him think of Sarah. She asked him if it still hurt to look at her. The question carried the weight of everything they had been through, the months of avoidance, the confessions and confrontations, the grief they had shared, and the healing they had found. Daniel looked at her face, at the eyes that were her own, and the smile that belonged only to her. He told her the truth. It still hurt, but it was a different kind of hurt now, the kind that reminded him he was still alive. They stood together in the early morning light, 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of a tragedy neither of them had caused. The pain hadn't disappeared. It never would entirely, but they had learned to carry it together. And in doing so, they had discovered something unexpected. Sometimes, looking at what hurts the most is the only way to heal. Not because the pain goes away, but because you learn to hold it alongside everything else. The love, the hope, the stubborn determination to keep walking forward even when every step reminds you of what you've lost.